In the 80s and 90s, the Bronx was a breeding ground for some of the most ruthless gangs in the nation's history. Among the most dangerous was sex, money, murder. And at the head of this organization was a man who has gone down in the history of New York City street life as a legend, Pistol Pete Rollick. Hailing from the notoriously unsafe Soundview projects of the Bronx, Pistol Pete became associated through his father as a boy with world-famous heroin kingpin Nicky Barnes, also known as Mr. Untouchable. Although his mother tried to raise him to follow a different path than his hustler father, even putting her son in Catholic school, as a boy, Pete was always drawn to ruthlessness and the relentless pursuit of power, which landed him his first serious prison sentence at Rikers Island when he was just 19 years old. Nicknamed for his ability to draw his gun faster than anyone else in the city, Pete fell into a crew of Bloods during his prison stay who tried to recruit him into the gang, but not one to settle for being a follower. Pete said he would only join the gang if he was allowed to have his own set, and that's how SMM was born. Upon his release from prison, Pistol Pete continued to add to his already insane body count, rumored by many to have reached over 3 dozen. As a leader of one of the first blood sets to distribute dope inside and outside state boundaries in the middle of the epidemic, Pistol Pete often tagged along on out-of-state trips with his crew as an enforcer to ensure his shipments reached Pennsylvania and North Carolina safely. This would turn out to be his downfall. Despite his almost supernatural ability to dodge hit charges, a trip to North Carolina gone wrong in '93 would later come back to haunt him. As of today, Pete Rook has been in solitary confinement for the past 28 years since he was just 20 years old, in conditions his lawyers have argued are completely inhumane. Because he orchestrated several hits from behind bars during his first few stints in prison, the Bureau of Prisons has refused to let him into the general population, only allowing him 1 hour of solitary exercise per day. Since his sentencing, Pete has accepted the hand he was dealt and made the best of his situation, even publishing a novel with the help of his family and earning his GED by taking education courses through closed-circuit television. To this day, the legend of Pistol Pete and the chokehold he had on the Bronx at such a young age continues to influence NYC street life. This is his story. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Peter Pistol Pete Rollick was born in the notoriously dangerous Soundview projects of the Bronx in 1974. His father, Leonard Rollick, was a notorious hustler who was said to be associated with legendary heroin kingpin Nicky Barnes. For the first few years of his childhood, Pete's mother put up with Leonard's criminal behavior, but when Pete turned 3 years old, she decided it wasn't good for her son to grow up in such a violent environment and left her husband, who ended up catching a 50-year prison sentence for dope charges soon after. During his early childhood, Pete didn't give his mother any problems. She put him in Catholic school and did her best to raise him differently from his father. But when Pete got into Stevenson Public High School as a teenager, things changed for the worse. With an unconscious adoration for his father, Pete was soon sticking up people on the streets and chasing money, women, and power in the most dangerous ways he could find. When he was 17, his mother could no longer control him and sent him to live with his father's friend George Wallace. Despite his mother's good intentions, this only made things worse, and pretty soon George was supplying Pistol Pete and his friends with dope to sell all over the city. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. As a natural leader and a remorseless hitman, Pete soon had a crew of underlings to help him transport crazy amounts of dope inside and outside of New York. One thing that really stood out about Pete was that while most gang leaders delegate the most gruesome tasks to their crew, Pistol Pete wasn't about that life. Real quick, after an out-of-town delivery trip in '93 turned sour, Pete went on that trip as an enforcer. This time, a dealer owed him $90,000 and was late on his payment. When the dealer failed to pay, Pistol Pete threatened to execute his wife, and the cops eventually caught wind of his plans. Even though they booked him and his crew for transporting dope in the van they were driving, he was able to walk by giving a false name and continued his dope dealing and hit spree for a few more months. In 1995, however, Pete's life went downhill for good. Around that time, Pistol Pete and Carlton Hines, a local basketball player with a scholarship to Syracuse, had some serious beef. Although Hines had a promising future, he had one foot in the dope game and another in basketball. After allegedly failing to pay Pete some money he owed him, Pete shot him outside a car stereo shop on Boston Road, also injuring his friend Carlos Murray in April of 1994. In an effort to tie off the loose ends of his previous hit, Pistol Pete shot Carlos Murray later as he walked out of a hip-hop store in the Bronx known as the Jew Man. In 1995, Pete was arrested at Grant's Tomb in Harlem for the shooting of Carlton Hines, a charge he eventually ended up beating. Because there were no eyewitnesses to the crime, he was the only one who shot him. Still, he was required to serve an 8-month mandatory sentence at Rikers Island for possessing a gun. This was another major turning point for Pistol Pete, as during that stay at Rikers, he was recruited into the Bloods, who gave him his own set at his request. According to several sources, Pete got the name Money Murder from an MC Pooh song of the same name. Once the 8-month sentence was up, his mom bailed him out, allowing Pete to begin one of the most gruesome sprees of his life, in which he recruited as many people from the Bronx as possible into his crew. With the either with me or against me mentality, Pistol Pete made sure the streets of the Bronx were soaked in red, but unknown to him, those would be the last 2 weeks of his life that he spent on the streets. Later that year, Pete was booked into custody after the feds matched up his prints in the NCICC computer database with the drug-filled van from his 1993 trip to North Carolina. With the help of David Gonzalez's testimony, one of Pete's former associates, he was transferred to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg County Jail in Charlotte, North Carolina, to await trial. At just over 20 years old, he would be spending the rest of his life behind bars. But for Pete, being jailed didn't mean he couldn't continue to be the leader of SMM. In 1997, after he was transferred to a jail in Carolina to face his charges, he sent a coded letter to his girlfriend that led to the shootings of 2 men during an annual Thanksgiving football game between residents of the Soundview and Castle Hill houses in the Bronx. To this day, the infamous incident is referred to as the Thanksgiving Day shootings in the Bronx. As it was later revealed, Pete was worried that another one of his associates, David Twin Mullins, was cooperating with the government and would end up making his sentence worse, so he ordered his shooting. After the crime was eventually tied back to him, the prosecutors demanded capital punishment for Pete. It was eventually agreed that he could have a plea deal as long as it included a mandatory life sentence. Another big demand the feds had was that because Pistol Pete had ordered some of the shootings he pleaded guilty to from jail years earlier, he would have to be placed in solitary confinement 23 hours a day and barred from communicating with anyone from the outside except for his immediate family. After agreeing to the deal in the same courthouse where his father had been imprisoned years before, Pete was sentenced to 3 back-to-back life sentences plus 105 years after pleading guilty to the shootings of 6 people, attempting to shoot 1 person, and conspiring to shoot another 2 people who were later shot by members of his gang. Around the time of Pete Rollick's sentencing, the authorities distributed posters in the Bronx that included his photograph and the words "life without parole" to scare away young wannabe gangsters from pursuing the life that had landed Pistol Pete in prison for the rest of his life. In November 2000, he was sentenced to the federal supermax prison facility in Florence, Colorado, where 400 of the nation's most infamous criminals are housed, including Ramzi Ahmed Youssef, who led the first attack on the World Trade Center in '93, the Unabomber, and Umar Farouk, the underwear bomber. Tim J. McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, was also held there before being executed in 2001 in Indiana. You would think that with the conviction to spend the rest of his life alone behind bars, Pete would have given up on life. But after almost 25 years in isolation at ADX Florence, Pete has spent thousands of hours taking education courses through closed-circuit television in his cell. He even earned his GED. And with the help of his family, he self-published his novel Trigger, described by his lawyer as a cautionary tale for young gangsters. Although his incarceration deal called for a revision of his solitary confinement after 18 months, the Bureau of Prisons deemed him unfit to be released into general population, and his solitary confinement continues to this day. Unfortunately, Pete hasn't really helped his own case. Before his sentencing in November 2000, he gave an interview to a magazine in which he disclosed the names of former gang members who had snitched on him. Because of his actions, the government had to place several people in the witness protection program. Even though Pete has been isolated from the world since his early 20s, his legacy has endured in the streets of the Bronx and NYC culture as a whole. In recent years, Pistol Pete graffiti has been found all over the Bronx, and during arrests and searches of blood members who had nothing to do with Pistol Pete or SMM, the cops have found tons of blood literature that glorify his legendary exploits. It's pretty crazy to think that a guy who spent most of his life in prison left such a lasting legacy on the streets he grew up in, and pretty messed up to realize how he ruined any chance he had at a good life with the mistakes he made during his youth. But that's what the gang life does to you. Despite the millions of dollars he's believed to have made, Pete's family is still in the streets. He'll pass away in prison, having spent his only years of freedom being a pawn in a game where no one ever wins. Tragic. As of today, sex, money, murder is still active in New York City, though much less powerful than when Pistol Pete was at the head of the organization. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment for more amazing videos on Underworld Icons.